So Nichole van Beek received a BFA from the Cooper Union in 1998 and an MFA from UC Santa Barbara in 2007. She has exhibited work at Jeff Bailey Gallery, both in Hudson and New York City, Geoffrey Young Gallery in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, Morgan Lehman Gallery in New York City, Interstitial in Seattle, White Flag Projects in St. Louis, Missouri, Ortega y Gasset, and Tiger Strikes Asteroid in Brooklyn, among many other spaces. She has attended residencies at the Vermont Studio Center through a grant from the Pollock-Krasner Foundation, Jentel Foundation, and Kingsbrae International Residency for the Arts. She was also the recipient of a New York Foundation for the Arts grant in painting in 2012. And in 2011, she participated in the Socrates Sculpture Park Emerging Artist Fellowship. She is currently a visiting artist here with us in SOVA and an assistant professor. We're very excited that she's here with us. She's researching non-toxic and biodegradable art materials such as mushroom foam, kombucha leather, bioplastics, and botanical inks. She has taught painting, drawing, photography, language, and research classes at Pratt Institute, SUNY Suffolk, Mount Holyoke College, and UC Santa Barbara. So with that, please.
All right, exciting. Well, I'm going to switch right over to the slides. So let me share my screen with you. And I'm hoping today that everything's going to go smoothly with this. So I decided to name this talk science fiction for a couple of reasons. One is that I feel like I kind of use scientific processes in my work as an artist, not as a scientist. So it's a kind of fiction making for the purpose of narrative. And I also think a lot about science fiction because it offers ideas about the future and kind of guides us in a very emotional way to think about what's going to happen and to lead us into sometimes what's called long thinking. So, you know, that's something that comes up for me a lot when I'm making my work. I'm so happy to be here in State College and to have been here for the last year. This is a kind of unusual landscape for me to live in and work in. I've lived in cities for most of my adult life. I lived in New York City for the 12 years before coming here. And I lived in Portland, Oregon. I also lived near Osaka in Japan for a couple of years. So very dense urban areas. Maybe Santa Barbara was the only place that I've lived for any period of time that was not a city. But my work is largely dealing with a relationship to nature. So this has been such an amazing opportunity for me to just have access to these more natural spaces. I've spent a lot of time in Rothrock, hiking, looking for mushrooms. And I'm getting to know more about agriculture in the area. You can see this patchwork of farms all around. So it's opening up a lot for me in terms of my work and the way I think about what I'm doing. And it's also just been such an amazing, beautiful, safe place to be during this pandemic. So I feel so deeply grateful to be here. I do want to acknowledge the history of this landscape. I feel like I haven't done enough to learn about the Susquehannock people that lived here, and I would like to know more about that. I would say that I think there can be more public acknowledgement of that history on campus and in State College in general. So that's something that I pledge to continue to learn about that history as I go forward here. One of the major reasons I'm here is because of this book. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with this book. It came out in 2017, and I pretty immediately started using it in my research classes. I was teaching research at Pratt Institute for graduate students in art design and architecture. It was just a kind of basic intro to research class, and we used this as the base text. So students were looking for connections between these solutions to climate change and the work they were doing in whatever field they were studying. And so this became like a great way to just connect, you know, really studied proposed solutions to climate change to design, art, and architecture work. And students came up with such creative ways that they could connect these maybe more scientific solutions to creative work. And so I wanted to continue to do that with my own work and with my teaching, to find ways to make those connections happen more easily. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my maybe more traditional studio work, also some of my work with activism, and a little bit about how some of those things overlap. This painting is a portrait of Andrew Wheeler, who is the current head of the EPA. He was the acting head in 2018 and was voted in 2019. In his inauguration speech, he said, "I believe that man has an impact on the climate, but what's not completely understood is what the impact is." So you can see we have a head of the EPA that wants to cast doubt about human involvement in climate change. This person was a lobbyist for coal and oil, and also for a mining company that wanted to reduce the size of Bears Ears National Monument for uranium mining. So I think for me, knowing that this person is the head of the EPA was extremely alarming. And, you know, as so much of the news is and has been over the years, you know, I wanted to have that reflect in this portrait of Andrew Wheeler. I think it's kind of a sickening space that's kind of melting and twisting, and the colors are pretty abrasive. So it was kind of just thinking about my kind of emotional space in relation to that news. About that time, there was also the most destructive wildfire in history happening in California. These wildfires, as you know, have names. This one was called Camp Fire. And so working in my studio, I was hearing news of this, not only most destructive, but also the most costly wildfire in human history in terms of destruction of property. It was just kind of raging and burning in my mind. So it just felt like I couldn't do anything but sort of depict that feeling of knowing these wildfires are happening. And of course, it's happening now as well. This weekend, of course, 10% of Oregon's population has been evacuated due to wildfires. And so this is something that's going to continue to happen. I also heard that only one newscaster on television news made a connection to climate change with these wildfires. So it's something that's still not really being talked about directly in our news media. Those two paintings were painted on canvas that was originally dyed with this photosensitive process. So I had been working with a photosensitive dye for a number of years, probably started in about 2014, 15 or so. This is my studio at Vermont Studio Center, where I had spent the month making these large-scale canvases. to be worked on in the coming years. So this is basically a photogram, it's a contact print, and I had wanted to get involved with this process because I had for a number of years just been working on purely abstract paintings in my studio. And I felt like my process of making work I was not really connecting to a really important part of myself, which was actually interacting with the environment. So I started to work with this process so that I could be outside and I could, look around at the plants and get to know a landscape better. Even though I'm not studying plants in the way a botanist would, I'm not looking at it scientifically, I feel like I did develop a better, keener awareness of my environment through working with this process. The dyes are really interesting because they come out of the bottle kind of grayish or neutral colored, like you see here, and sitting in the sun for about 15 minutes, the colors develop. So it's like a really magical process. I'm really inspired by this woman, Anna Atkins. She was a botanist and the first person to publish a book of photographs in the 1840s. She made books of seaweed, of ferns. She was prolific. There was a show recently at the New York Public Library of her work, and it was endless books filled with her studies. And she's not well known. I mean, her family was friends with Henry Fox Talbot, who invented photography, but it's not always, I mean, I didn't learn that in my photography classes in school, that there was a woman who was an artist and a botanist, and she was such a major part of photographic history. These paintings were all started at the Vermont Studio Center, where I did the dyeing, and over the following year, I worked the paintings on top. So it's the photosensitive dye with acrylic on top. And a lot of the compositions come from letter forms. I was working on this not long after Trump was elected. And actually right when I was working on this painting, Steve Bannon was removed from the Security Council, National Security Council. And the words in the painting and the title of the painting are the same. So it's a play on these letters, Ban Bannon. And I felt like it was really special that he was removed as I was making this painting. It was kind of appropriate for the imagery as well, which looks kind of maybe a little witchy, or like it might have some kind of spiritual properties. I had done all of the dyeing for the canvases right around the summer solstice, and all of the paintings were going into a show that was going to be in the summer solstice on the following year. And there was also a lot of language related to rising that was, being thrown around in kind of activist circles, like rise up, rise and resist. And so I was thinking about that connection of sunrise, people rising up and being active, and kind of the rhythm of that, the rhythm of longer days, shorter days throughout the year. So a lot of the paintings in this group have an exploration of repetition, of rhythm. And again, this is letter forms that are abstracted and not necessarily meant to be read in any way, but that's where the compositions come from. During this time, there was also the Dakota Access Pipeline protests going on, and the indigenous term for the pipeline was a black snake. And so I had been drawing a lot of images of this black snake. And this one is not letter forms, but it is a kind of calligraphic mark. So instead of thinking of letter forms as typography here, I was thinking about it more as just a hand drawn mark. A lot of the letter forms started to become really mathematical in the way that I was laying out the compositions, the way that I was thinking about dimensionality. And I realized at a certain point that I had not really studied geometry since 9th grade. And so at a certain point, I went back into geometry textbooks and just tried to learn more about geometry. And it really opened up a lot for me because I thought I had a very rudimentary understanding of geometry, and it's much more complex, and it's not necessarily something you study as an art student at all, which is strange to me because there's a lot of overlap with compositional interest. And this is a variation of a 4th dimensional object. And that doesn't mean 4th dimension as in time. It's if you move from a point to a plane to a 3-dimensional object, and then you go beyond that to a 4th dimensional object, which is basically represented as 2 cubes that are connected to each other. I've always been really fascinated by illusions in art, and I especially like that you know, it references kind of like cheesy imagery, like MC Escher imagery, things like that. I don't know why, it just it's like something that I like to look at, but I also think is a little bit funny. This piece is actually just 10 separate pieces of canvas that are stapled to the wall. So the canvas was dyed outdoors as I was looking at the landscape in Wyoming. This is made in the residency in Wyoming. So it's bringing in the landscape in a different way. And at this point, I was still using acrylic dye. I hadn't yet gone into using natural dyes. So that piece I think of as a kind of science fiction landscape. And at about the time that I was making that piece, I was reading Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. This book is from 1993. And I would say it's hands down my favorite science fiction book ever. And she is the best science fiction writer. She is just amazing. This book is incredible. And it's also incredible because it reached the New York Times bestseller list this month. It was written in 1993. So I think, you know, it is spreading like wildfire too, because people are realizing that the story in this book is basically, she's told us what the future is, and it's frightening. It is apocalyptic. It is a story of the crumbling of our society. The main character, Lauren Olamina, is in a gated community in Southern California, and basically society is collapsing down around her. I think when we talk about climate change, it's always important to kind of think about ways to connect to a narrative that really pulls at our hearts. I said that Drawdown was the reason that I was here, but I actually think that this book might be the real reason I'm here, because this book like lives inside of me and kind of motivates me all the time. And of course, this is a common sentiment. This is from the March for Science in 2017, that science fiction writers have that ability to connect the science to the narratives. And I would add Cormac McCarthy's The Road, of course, to this list, which is also a tale of the darkest desperation ever. Around that time, 2017, I started to get really involved with healthcare activism as well. And part of the reason was because my friend Sarah Bednarik, who was an artist on the left there, she had cancer and she passed away in December of last year. When Trump became president, she was terrified because they were talking about changing the rules for access to Medicare, which she was on, and she depended on it for her life. And through this work with her and talking about healthcare, we did a lot of research into universal healthcare and started to do more work with universal healthcare advocacy, specifically universal healthcare on a state level. So New York had a universal healthcare plan. The plan was in the legislature for maybe 20 years. So it was a plan that had been floating around, and we decided to do more activist work around that and to make signs, make agitprop, make zines. We kind of did all that we could to research the issue and also to participate as artists in that activism. One of the projects that I did was called Everyone is Covered. And this was for the Forward Union Fair. And the Forward Union Fair was a social justice action group fair. So each group had their own table. New York Health is the advocacy group for universal healthcare in New York, but there was probably 50 social justice groups there. And they invited artists to participate. So it was activist art and social justice organizations. And this took place in Chelsea. This is kind of the outcome of several months of putting this together. So that is just a couple of panels of canvas on the wall, and then hand lettering that I did. And then these drawings I collected over several sessions that I did with participants throughout the city. So basically I would set up a table and ask people to draw a New Yorker with me to support universal healthcare. And so all of the drawings that are collected are done by different people who sit down at the table with me. And I talk about healthcare with them and talk about universal healthcare and what that means. So I had to become really educated about it, and the process of talking to people, I learned a lot about people's struggle with healthcare and having access. What was interesting was that people would sit with me and then tell me their stories about having access or not. And I had literature there talking about universal healthcare, and so I got to learn a lot about people's lives. People were really open about sharing with me. It seemed like the process of drawing just relaxed people, and then also created this little space for community. This was in the East Village. This one was at a Black-owned business fair in Brooklyn. Often I would become like the kids' table, which was great. I felt like I was really providing a service wherever I would set this up. And then often the parents would come and sit with me, and so I would have a chance to talk about healthcare with the parents as well. And I really remember a lot of the stories. So this little girl, her mom, I was talking to her mom, and her mom was in between jobs and didn't have any health care. And so, it was a way for me. This was in my neighborhood in Ridgewood. I just got to sit outside and talk to people about what was going on with their health care. That was kind of the the second large-scale community project I did with Ford Union Fair. The first one was just this illustration of the New York State Senate. I had been guilty of not really paying attention to state level politics that carefully. And in New York, at that time, we had a faction of Democrats. They were considered Democrats, but they always voted as Republicans. So it was really strange because they were voted in as Democrats, but they caucused with Republicans. And that's all the members there in yellow. So there was a really high level of corruption because people were going to the voting booths, not really knowing how their representatives were voting, and they were just checking off Democrat without even knowing what the representatives were doing. And after this, there was a midterm election after this was made, and all of those candidates or all of those representatives were voted out of office. So there was a lot of discussion at the time about who these people were and what was going on. This was, again, Forward Union Fair. This was in a different space the year before. And I had invited artist friends to come and draw the senators. We worked on this for about a week. And it was really a great space for learning. People were looking up the senators and finding all about them and learning about what they did and what they supported. And so it became a really great community project just to learn about state level government. And it was really fun how each person drew the senator in their own way. So it added a lot of life, I think, to the portraits overall, to have different people drawing in their own styles. So I was working in the studio, working on activist projects, and then, of course, all of this rumbling is going on about climate change in the background. And this, for some reason, this IPCC special report on global warming came out in the fall of 2018, and it just hit me. It hit me so hard, and I read the whole report. I don't normally do that, but there was just some of the basic information of it was really coming through to me, and I just wanted to understand it better. And so I just want to read this out loud because I think this basic set of information was really what was striking me. So human-induced warming reached approximately 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels in 2017. So, it's 100 plus years that it took to rise 1 degree Celsius. But going forward, the increase is happening exponentially. So we are trying to stay below 1.5 degrees rise Celsius. But to do that, we have to reduce our emissions by about half, or 45%, by 2030. So we have 10 years to reduce all of our emissions by half, which is scary enough to think that we have to try to do that in 10 years. But then we're supposed to reach no emissions by 2050. And the thought of reaching no emissions in such a short time period, it seems to me impossible. I don't want to say that because then it means that what are we going to do? Give up hope? No. I mean, of course, we have to keep working towards whatever we can. But I think we also have to recognize that the scale of the changes that need to take place is enormous. And it's not universal, of course, because if you think about emissions, the biggest emitters would probably be corporations. But then if you're talking on an individual level, us living in the United States, we're going to be individually emitting a lot more than you know, someone that lives in a village with no electricity. So so me personally, if I put it on a human scale, for me personally, if I am going to reduce my emissions by 50% in the next 10 years, that means that I have to really change my lifestyle. And my emissions, because I live in the United States, I might need to reduce that even more than 50%. And so, you know, I think when you start to think of it in terms of your own life and how you create emissions, then you start to see that so much of the structure of what we do has to change, and has to change really rapidly. And I think with this report, which I would strongly suggest everyone to read, it's easily accessible online. They have it summarized by section. It's so readable. It is not anything that's scientific jargon at all. It's just something that's like really plain. And I have to say, it's terrifying. And I hate to, like, you know, focus on this. I just pulled out some of the results of not staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. And we are already feeling the effects of climate change. Extreme heat waves, heavy precipitation, increased droughts. Of course, these are major changes in our weather patterns, risk to energy, food, and water systems. So everything that we have set up is going to be need to be reevaluated and changed. People in poverty, coastal cities, of course, that's a lot of communities of color as well. There's a greater risk to certain populations over others. Here in State College, we might be relatively safe for a while, but of course, if you care about the way people live in the rest of the world, then this is a major you know, a major change that's coming. Rising sea levels, ocean acidification, death of marine life, loss of biodiversity, mass extinction. If you've seen any of the biodiversity reports, we have just lost so much of plant and animal species around the planet in the last 40 years. So it's just something to really know that when you're working on climate change issues, it's affecting everything. And it's something that we can't just ignore it. We can't just like keep going with the way we've been living. Everything needs to change. And no matter what you can do, it's something. And so for me, with that report, that made me really want to just change everything that I was doing. But of course you can't do that. You can't just throw everything out. So I wanted to see how I could do it with my art practice. One thing that has always haunted me has been this project at Socrates Sculpture Park. I've always been aware of environmental issues and tried to connect my understanding of being environmentally friendly to my practice as an artist. With this project, I started with the idea of using found materials. These are found ceramics. So I spent, you know, a couple months just going to thrift stores and garage sales and collecting all of these ceramics that I could find, with the idea that I was, you know, not buying new materials, and I was just utilizing or reusing materials. But unfortunately, in order to make this sculpture, which ended up being, I think, about 4 tons, I welded a steel armature and then covered it with concrete. And at the time, I didn't know that concrete is one of the #1 causes of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. The production of concrete. I was thinking of concrete as something similar to a stone, or, you know, I wasn't quite thinking about the whole process of burning it and the emissions that result from concrete. So for me, concrete is now really a symbol of greenhouse gas emissions. It's kind of as if this this pile of and this was all animals and plants that I had collected, ceramic figurines. They're kind of, you know, just shooting out of the ground. It's just a sore spot for me that I purchased all of that material. And, you know, when I think about my own responsibility for greenhouse gas emissions with this project, it's enormous. It's probably, you know, more than some people use in a lifetime. So I think that happened just because of I just wasn't connecting the material use to greenhouse gas emissions. So in reflection of that project, I think I've taken a number of steps and tried to think about different ways of using materials. This piece in 2017 was thinking about just almost completely dematerializing and trying to occupy a larger space with almost nothing. This is just dyed cotton cord and dried plants. Those dried stalks of grass are just really delicately balanced. That landscape around there where I had installed this is in Wyoming, was a very delicate landscape. It's extremely dry. And all of the grasses in that landscape were so delicate, it felt like any spark or flame would have sent wildfires throughout the whole landscape. So I was hoping that the way these plants were placed here kind of echoed the delicacy of that landscape. Another project that I did was to do an entire installation that fit in a suitcase. So this was in a space in Seattle. And I tried to bring all of the work with me in one suitcase to avoid shipping costs and to avoid packaging. And so all the work came out of the suitcase. It was fabric-based work. This was a hanging macrame table that was hand knotted and dyed. And these were all sun prints that were also just unstretched canvas. So again, it's another form of kind of minimizing materials or dematerializing the work and having it occupy a larger space with a smaller amount of material. I was thinking about this as a kind of science fiction landscape, so that hanging macrame table to me became like a ship, and there was the universe in the back triangle there, stars falling onto the ground. And this was kind of in reference to maybe collecting samples from a landscape. Just go back to this for a second. Even though I was kind of cutting back on the kind of size of materials, cutting back on packaging, on shipping, I still was using this photosensitive dye, and the process of the dye was starting to bother me because I was going out into the landscape, picking plants, laying it on the canvas, and then the canvas has to be washed in the washing machine, and basically all that dye just gets released into the water system. And I was never able to really confirm how toxic that dye is. Same thing with cyanotype. I've done research. I am not able to really find out how toxic that cyanotype chemicals are in the waterways. And same for me is with acrylic paint. Acrylic paint might not be toxic or that toxic to breathe in, but if we are just pouring that paint into the water system, you know, cleaning brushes, cleaning whatever you use to paint with acrylic, this is even considering house paint, everything that we're doing, you know, we're just kind of spilling that back into the waterways. And it's often not getting filtered out. So, so I think, you know, for me, I'm still struggling with trying to think about materials where I'm really taking into account the full life cycle of the materials. Where is it coming from? How am I using it? And where is it going to in the end? So for me, thinking about materials and ways to have lower emissions and lower toxicity with materials has been a form of hope. And this is a quote from Parable of the Sower. The main character writes these verses because she has a vision of the future of something called Earthseed. And to me, that's just basically hope for the future. So it says here, you are Earthseed, one of many, one unique, one small seed, one great promise, tenacious of life, shaper of God, water, fire, sculptor, clay. You are Earthseed, and your destiny, the destiny of Earthseed, is to take root among the stars. So the main character goes through these this horrific you know, collapse of society, loss of family members, but she perseveres because of this idea of Earthseed, of the future, of something good. And so, like I said before, I'm right now sort of putting my hope in regenerative materials. For me, that means materials that can be grown locally, that don't need to be shipped, that don't really need to be processed heavily, minimally processed. Materials that are biodegradable or can be composted, that can just return to the landscape and regenerate as new materials. So I'm kind of looking at ways to bring these materials more into art practice, because a lot of them right now are being used in design, but maybe not as much in the field of art. This is a myco-composite. So this is basically hemp, dried hemp herds, strange word, but just chunks of dried hemp that's been infused with mycelium. And the mycelium grows throughout the hemp, and then the process is stopped in a drying process. It's basically the way mushrooms are grown commercially. They're just grown in a substrate of some kind. And at some point, the mushroom will grow out of this. It's called fruiting when the mushroom grows out of this material. But I'm not letting it get to the point of fruiting. Right now, I've mostly just been using this packaged material by a company called Ecovative, and you can buy a bag of it. It's hemp that's already been infused with mycelium. Ecovative is developing a lot of applications for this material. One of them is as a replacement for styrofoam in packaging. So say if you want to send a wine bottle, instead of using styrofoam packaging, you could use this mycelium foam. I kind of make a distinction between myco-foam and myco-composites. To me, myco-composites they have this substrate in it, so it's a little chunkier. Myco-foam doesn't really have the substrate in it. It's more like a foam, like a rubber. So this is one easy way to access this material, but I'm really interested in developing maybe larger scale production or production that can be used in a classroom. So it would be nice to be able to just have access to agricultural waste that can be then turned into sculptures or sculptural projects. So right now I'm working on using local hay instead of hemp, because hemp production in Pennsylvania is pretty minimal still. But there's other agricultural products that can be used for this. And I'm also testing different types of mushrooms to see what would be the best to use with whatever substrate I can find that's local. I was really inspired by these two works. Eric Clarenbeek printed this chair, and Tom Lauerman and I looked at some videos of Eric Clarenbeek's studio, and we seemed to come to the conclusion that this was not actually the mushroom that was printed. It was the kind of bioplastic casing that was then filled with a mycocomposite, but I'm not totally sure. I know that mushrooms can be 3D printed, or the mycelium can also be 3D printed. So there's a lot of interesting applications for that material. And this one on the right is a pavilion that was built at PS1. So there's architectural applications for this mycocomposite that are that's being explored in a lot of different ways. But it is highly biodegradable. So there are some ways to treat it. You know, I've heard people talking about covering it with salt to make it less biodegradable or to make it longer lasting. So that's something that I'm also learning about, is different rates of biodegradability, how to prolong the life of something, or how to make it biodegrade faster, depending on the material. I've also been testing out kombucha scobies as a potential material. I'm sure you've all had some kombucha at some point. And the SCOBY is the culture of bacteria and yeast that grows on the top. It's basically bacteria and yeast that is eating the tea and the sugar and creating the kombucha. And if you take that SCOBY and dry it out, it becomes a kind of translucent material like this. And it can be formed into a three-dimensional shape. It can be used as a paper or a leather substitute. It also picks up textures really well. So this piece was dried, you can see, on a very textured surface. And so you can kind of get it to be whatever texture you're interested in. This is a piece by Adina Alman. And you can see that there's a lot of potential for using this material, not just as a 2D substrate, but also in 3D works. It's also highly biodegradable. So I've had a couple pieces now for maybe 2 years or so in my studio. They don't completely fall apart, but they are very sensitive to humidity. So they change a lot depending on how humid the weather is. And so that's something that I'm learning, is how these materials function over time, and how that would affect them being in an art context. So that's also part of the research. Another material that I'm really interested in is bioplastics, and there's so many ways of creating bioplastics. But this does bring up a lot of questions for me about biodegradability, because some bioplastics are more biodegradable than others, and depending on the thickness or depending on what it's mixed with, that changes the biodegradability. So I'm also learning a lot about just the idea of biodegradability and what that means. Here on the left, the biocomposites are mixed with other you know, kind of chunkier substrates. I think that's pine needles and corn in the back. On the right, this is a bioplastic made from lobster shells. Slides are not going forward, sorry. I'm somehow jumping all over. It's going so well. There we go. I am currently looking into making bioplastics with these two invasive species of plants. So similar to the way that this biocomposite on the left is made with pine needles, I would like to use these mugwort and teasel, which you might have seen, they grow all over. They're invasive, they're non-native to Pennsylvania, and they basically just have to be removed when they take over a landscape. They kind of crowd everything. And so this is a kind of biomass that's available that's really just has no use after it's taken out. It's just going to be composted or thrown away. So for me, if I can turn that into an art material, that would be really exciting. So I'm working on drying that now and different formulas to see what kind of material I can turn that into. And I've been learning a lot about the local landscape through making inks as well. You know, coming from a city, I just didn't really pay attention to the plants around me that much. And so it's been so exciting to learn that there's just these, you know, readily available sources for colorants. And these are three that I've explored in the last year: pokeberry, goldenrod, and black walnut. And these plants are kind of everywhere, easy to gather. And over this last year, I've made some of my own inks and used some from friends that have made inks. A company called BioHue makes botanical inks as well, and Botanical Colors is also a natural dye supplier. So as a painter, of course, it's really exciting to know that there is a biodegradable option for colorants, that I don't have to resort to materials that were mined and then processed or are synthesized and chemically artificial, that this can still, you know, the whole spectrum of colors can still exist within this framework of biodegradability. And in fact, the colors that are coming up with these botanical sources, most of these are botanical. This cochineal, that kind of pink color there, is actually from an insect. But the colors that are coming up are incredibly beautiful. So it is like, it's not only just been fun that they're biodegradable, but it's like, it's a whole new color spectrum for me that's just really fun to work with and to see how the colors fit together. The paintings that I've been making have been all on paper, and they basically are extensions of color studies. It's just seeing how the colors function together, really allowing for the transparencies. They work a lot like watercolors, so they're very transparent and offer a lot of possibility for layering. And the color is the thing itself. So it's really interesting, you know, that if you have marigold, that's coming from a marigold, indigo is coming from the indigo plant. There's just a lot of, I think, possibility there in terms of just having those colors interact with each other. So I haven't really been shaping exactly what the compositions are. They're largely pattern-based, and these are all pretty new, so my language around talking about what they are is not fully defined yet, but they're largely pattern-based. A lot of them are organic in shape and reference landscapes. And they're coming out of a set of systems. I'm not planning them at all before I start. So it's more like I kind of think of a system for putting down color, and maybe a language of mark making, and then the painting kind of results. So it's a process of discovery as I'm painting, which is really exciting. And it's surprising to me what comes out, because you know, it often is landscape based, which is kind of fascinating, even though I'm not necessarily controlling that. All right, well, we're getting to the end, and I just wanted to mention a couple of final things. So I have been really working mainly on material explorations, but I also have continued to try to explore more social practice and activist work as well as I'm here. And I got really involved with this project called Climate Crossover, which is stemming out of a group, Awakened State. This is a multi-generational group of students and professors and retired professors that meet pretty regularly to talk about climate initiatives, and specifically how to push Penn State to be more sustainable. So it's been really great for me to connect with people in all different fields of study. And this Climate Crossover initiative was, and it's still going on, is a way to help professors across disciplines connect to each other and to bring climate change discussions into every classroom. So no matter what subject someone is teaching, there is a way to bring climate change into the classroom. For example, we had one workshop last spring before COVID, and a Spanish teacher came, and she was kind of thinking, oh, I would like to bring climate change into the classroom, and she wasn't really sure about that. And then we were talking about how climate affects, you know, immigration and refugees, and you know, that was a way that she could start to think about talking about climate change. And so this initiative was just to, you know, kind of spark ideas, spark conversations between professors. This is still going on. It's a limited now because we can't do in-person meetings, but we will be doing a workshop in October, and leading up to more projects happening next spring. So if you're interested in that and interested in, you know, participating in that discussion of how to bring that in, especially into classrooms where climate change is not necessarily the focus, please get in touch with me. You can either visit their website, awakenstate.org, or send me an email. You know, it doesn't have to be a kind of semester-long exploration, but I think it would be, you know, of course, useful for everyone to have some climate content in the classroom at some point. And this is, lastly, just some general ideas. You know, I know that I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, but it's always good to have reminders of things that can be done. And these are pretty simple. So voting for candidates that support swift action on climate change, working to demand change from political and institutional leaders. On Saturday in an Awakened State meeting, we were talking about requesting the day off from President Barrington for Election Day. So that is something that we're trying to develop a student initiative to ask him to give everyone the day off so that we are sure to vote. Talking about climate change. So this is so basic. You know, just making sure you feel confident with basic facts, and then just talking about them with anyone. It's like a simple thing that can be done, is just making sure that's in the forefront. Figuring out how to lower, you know, your own personal emissions footprint. Buying local is something that's connects you to local landscape, and also helps to lower emissions. There's a sustainable studio class. If there's any students listening that don't know about that, Kim Flick and Helen O'Leary teach that class, and it's a great way to start getting involved with material explorations. And then if you're a teacher, I would love to know if you want to participate in this climate crossover project. And of course, doing everything alone is impossible. So one of the most important things to do is to participate in group actions. Student groups, I know on campus, Eco Action and Sunrise, there are so many others. You know, there's like the vegan group, there's a kind of sustainability group in every department. So, so there's a lot of opportunity there. This group that I have been working with is Awaken State. And then there's community groups like the DSA, Penn Future, Citizens Climate Lobby, and Nittany Valley Environmental Coalition. So staying up to date with a group just helps you stay focused and, you know, puts the pressure off of you a little bit. All right. I think that's it. Okay, now everybody's asleep, I know, right? No?
Well, thank you so much for that. And people are thanking you in the chat.
Oh, thank you guys for being here. I appreciate you all listening in.
So we do have some questions. Let's see. So from Michelle, she asks, do you work primarily with cyanotype and then dye, paint or tone the finished work? Or are there other types of photosensitive dyes that you have developed that you use in your process as well?
I actually started working with the photosensitive dye before cyanotype. The photosensitive dye is manufactured by Jacquard, and it comes in a range of colors, just like paint does. It comes, of course, in a light-proof bottle, so you can't see the colors. You have to paint it on in a relatively dark space, and then you have to lay everything down while it's wet, and then bring it out into the sun while the dye is wet on the canvas or surface. So it's a little bit tricky setting up a space where that all can take place. The difference with cyanotype is that it's just two chemicals that you mix together, and you can paint it onto a surface and let it dry. And so you can work with the substrate dry. You don't have to work with it wet. It makes it a lot easier because you can let that dry overnight, and then you can put it in a light-proof bag and take it out whenever you want to use it. So those are just two different materials, slightly different working processes, but they're both light sensitive. And there's a lot of other light sensitive processes that are used to make photograms. And so that's, you know, that's a whole other discussion. Yeah.
Another question from Heather. I wonder if some of these materials would drive conservation scientists nuts.
What does that mean? I don't know if I can ask a question back about the question. some of these materials would drive conservation scientists nuts. Yeah, I don't know if I understand the question, and I don't know what materials exactly are being asked about. So
I think Heather added their changes over time, their breakdown. So I'm guessing this is maybe a question about archival quality.
The archival nature, yes. So in working with the biodegradable materials, I'm looking for materials that can last for a long enough period of time, but that actually the biodegradability is an asset rather than something that is seen as you know, a detriment to the work. And I think through this work, I have to reframe what we think about art. You know, it's a completely different way of thinking about what art is, because I think especially with, say, oil painting, we want the oil painting to last forever. And with a lot of sculpture, we want it to last forever, you know, and that's of course what the market wants as well. I mean, you want an object that's going to be an investment, that's going to be passed down, that's going to be housed in a museum or something like that. But I think if you're talking about something that's biodegradable, it's something that's just used by the person who's looking at it just then. And it could be something that's so biodegradable that it only lasts, you know, a year. And to me, that's really useful, say, in art education context. So if you think about all the art that gets made to learn about art making, that doesn't necessarily have to be museum quality or museum grade, then it's totally fine if it's biodegradable. And that's, I think, the majority of art being made is not going to go into a museum. So I think that concept of archivalness is something that should be really challenged.
Let's see, I think two more questions, and then I see a handful of you wanted to pass information along to Nichole.
Great.
So I will do that.
Yes.
Different shows, different writers, different professors that they think you should think up with. Okay, the next question. Chris says, I really appreciate you sharing your process and trajectory with honesty and transparency to demonstrate your own evolution in relation to material choices. Thank you for opening the history of your practice to us. I suspect that some of the greatest abuses of non-biodegradable materials in contemporary practice are supported by the structures that create the canon of visual art. I'm curious about if you've had any conversations with museums or archiving specialists about the possible decay rate of your newer work, or even if you've had casual conversations about the topic with archival workers. So very related to the last.
Yeah, I haven't had conversations about that specifically, but I would love to. I think it's always interesting that when I start talking about, especially the botanical inks, one of the first things people ask me is it archival? Do the colors last? And I'm like, that's not the point. And no, they're not as archival as, you know, a mineral-based pigment would be. But that's also the beauty of it. So like I said before, it does take a kind of reframing, I think, and it would be a challenge to conservation. And even though I might be using biodegradable materials, I would think that if it does enter into the current system in the way that the system is, then people will want to preserve it and want to keep it. So I do have to think about how to make that impossible and to make it so that it does biodegrade and that it isn't something that is meant to be kept forever. And that should be part of the concept of it as well, I think.
Yeah. A different Chris. Nichole, very recently, a Pew Foundation poll came out and ranked climate change 11th on a list ranking voters' concerns, with the economy and healthcare ranked number 1 and 2. Why do you think climate change is not ranked higher?
I mean, I think because it's just such a big problem. You know, it's hard for individuals to see the effects of climate change, whereas you might, of course, have everyday experience with healthcare issues, with problems going to the doctor or having insurance or whatever that is. So that concerns everybody on a daily level, on a visceral level, whereas climate change is not something that you can just walk outside and see. And so you do have to study it and understand it to a certain degree to be really concerned about it. And I think there's also still a media kind of blackout on it. Like I said before, the fact that these wildfires are raging in California and Oregon, all along the West Coast states, and no news is reporting on it being connected to climate change. It's just like, I think people just don't want to raise those alarms. They want to keep it kind of silent because it's such a monumental problem that affects everything that we're doing. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons why it's not on the top, although I think it should be absolutely number 1.
A new question just came in. 2 more questions just came in, and then perhaps for the sake of time, that'll be it. Mm-hmm. So Mark says, I experience your work as engaging in advocacy in and through your situatedness. I wondered what your thoughts are about how art can reframe and connect us to the, in quotes, big picture issues. For example, I'm interested in your Anthropocene work, how you see the global picture of humanity, our presence in and contribution to the natural world, and how this relates to your art.
Whew, that's a big question. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think we talked a little bit about the system of art, the difference between being an individual artist and knowing that I am a part of the system of art. And I think those are 2 different things. What we do in our studios is different than what we do when we participate in the system of galleries and global capitalism. And I think, you know, I started to get just a glimpse of that living in New York and selling work in galleries. I would make artwork. I would put so much thought and love and intention and meaning into everything that I was making. And then it would go into the gallery and then somebody would buy it. And I don't know what happened to all that thought and love and intention. It just disappeared into this system of commerce. Or if you would go into an art fair, there's not so much focus on the intention and the love and the devotion that artists are putting into the work. It just becomes a commodity. And so I don't know, I think this question of what does art do? That was a big question. You know, I think on an individual level, it does a lot because it's, you know, it's putting together these imaginative forces and making me reach inside to like my deepest, most important thoughts or feelings and putting that all together into something. But if then I just put that into a kind of capitalist system, it doesn't have that same meaning. So I think there's a lot of discussion or decision making that has to be done in terms of art having meaning or effect. And I think that public art and social practice is a good way to go and a good way to think about other potentials for art rather than just art existing within gallery and museums.
Okay, last question. Martha asks, have any of these materials been patented? What difficulties would the artist be confronted with if these involve genetic ownership?
Well, the mushroom materials, no, because it's just, you know, it's just mushroom spores of different species mixed with different substrates. So there definitely are companies like MycoWorks and Ecovative that are working to patent their own specific formula of those things, because it does take years of research to determine what mushroom species and what food, what substrates those need to create the best materials. And so they are, like MycoWorks is another company, they are making leather replacement with mushrooms. And it's beautiful, it really looks like leather. But that's their whole process is, you know, that's a really difficult point to get the material to be at. So that's why it's patented. So I think it just has to be a specific enough formula. It's not necessarily the genetics that are patented or the, you know, I think anyone, it's still open source enough that anyone can kind of get into it. But yeah, I can't, and I think in terms of the other materials that I mentioned, I can't think of anything that there's really any kind of like proprietary ownership on, besides just maybe the specific working methodology for specific applications.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I very much appreciate your attendance and your questions. I love the chat personally. Nichole, I hope you get a chance to scroll through that and see everyone thanking you, different comments and things like that.
Yeah.
So with that, that concludes our session today, our lecture. And like I said, this is recorded, so it will be sent out to those who registered.